In 1826, a starving man climbed into forbidden mountains. He went to beg creatures his tribe had avoided for generations. 3 days later, he walked back down. He was not alone. Behind him came 4 giants. They saved his people from starvation that winter, but they asked for one thing in return: a promise. That promise has been kept for 207 years. Every generation, every father whispering it to his son. Until me, I am 89 years old, I am dying, and I am about to break that promise for the first time in 2 centuries, because what I know could save them, or it could destroy everything my ancestors built. My name is Joseph Silent River, and Bigfoot is real. I have known them my entire life. I have watched them grieve their dead. I have watched them celebrate their newborns. I have held the hand of one as he died. But before I tell you what they are, I need to tell you what they did for my family, and why breaking my silence might be the only way to keep them alive. I was born on the Quinault Reservation in 1937, the same year the Hindenburg fell from the sky. My mother went into labor during a thunderstorm that knocked out power to the entire reservation. I came into this world by candlelight, in a cabin my great-grandfather built with his own hands. Cedar logs he cut and shaped without power tools. My people have lived in these forests for 10,000 years. We have names for every ridge and valley, names that white maps have never recorded, names that white tongues have never learned to pronounce. We know which berries are safe and which will kill you in hours. We know where the salmon spawn in October. We know where the bears sleep through the dark months. We know where the elk gather when the first snow falls. We know things that have been forgotten by everyone else. And we know about the old ones. That is what we call them. The old ones. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, the large men of the forest. My people have a dozen names for them, names that describe their appearance, their habits, the feeling that comes over you when you are in their presence. But in my family, the keepers of the pact, we have always called them simply the old ones, because they were here before us. They were here before anyone. My grandfather told me this when I was 7 years old. We sat by the fire while rain hammered the windows. The wind howled through the cedars like a living thing. He told me the old ones watched us arrive from the north, small bands of hunters following the retreating ice, wrapped in furs, carrying spears made of bone. He told me they observed us for generations, watching as we spread across the land, as we learned its secrets, as we became part of its fabric. And he told me something that changed everything I believed. They decided we could stay. Think about that. They decided. They had been here so long, they remembered when the mountains were born, when fire came from the earth and the land was remade in smoke and thunder. They had seen the ice come and go 4 times. They had watched species rise and fall like waves on the ocean. They are not animals, my grandfather whispered, his voice dropping so low I had to lean close to hear. They are not spirits. They are people, different from us, larger and stronger, more attuned to the forest than we could ever be, but people nonetheless, with families, with memories, with knowledge passed down through more generations than anyone could count. And 200 years ago, when our ancestors were starving and the world seemed determined to end them, the old ones came down from the high places. They offered help. That is how the pact began. But what did they ask for in return? What could creatures who had survived for millions of years possibly want from humans? The answer would take me years to fully understand. I did not believe my grandfather when he first told me this story. Not at first. I had been to the white man's school in Tahola. They taught us our old stories were superstitions. Our beliefs were primitive. We needed to abandon everything our ancestors knew. They cut our hair the first day we arrived. My long black braids fell to the floor while my mother watched through the window, tears streaming down her face. They forbade our language, punished us if we spoke it, even to each other, even in whispers. They told us creatures like the old ones existed only in the imaginations of backward people, people who had not yet accepted the light of civilization and progress. I was ashamed of my grandfather's stories. I nodded politely when he spoke. Then I went back to my books about airplanes and automobiles. I dreamed of leaving the reservation, of going to college, of becoming someone important. I thought I was smarter than my grandfather. I thought I understood the world better than a man who had never left the forest, who had never ridden in an automobile, who had never seen a building taller than 3 stories. I was wrong about everything. My grandfather knew more about the true nature of this world than anyone I have ever met, before or since. His knowledge just did not come from books. It came from something far older and far more reliable. June 23, 1951. I remember the date because it changed the course of my entire life. I was 14 years old. My grandfather told me I was ready. Ready for what? I did not know. He gave me a small leather pouch filled with dried salmon. He told me to walk east until I reached the place where 3 creeks met. He told me to sit there and wait. He told me to be patient. And then he said something that made no sense at the time. He said they would know I was coming, because they always knew. How? How could creatures in the deep forest know a 14-year-old boy was walking toward them? The answer would come soon enough. I left at sunrise. The mist was so thick the trees seemed to appear out of nowhere, materializing from the white like dreams, taking solid form. The trail my grandfather described was exactly where he said it would be, a faint path through the undergrowth. I had played in these woods my entire life. I had never noticed this trail before. How had I missed it all those years? The answer would not come until much later. But I understand now. Some paths only reveal themselves when you are ready to walk them. The forest was different that day. The trees were larger. Their trunks so massive 5 men could not have linked arms around them. The shadows were deeper, darker, more substantial. The silence was more complete, broken only by the occasional call of a bird, the distant rush of water. I felt like I was being watched from the moment I entered the woods. Not threatened, not afraid, observed, measured, evaluated. Like I was taking a test I had not studied for, and the graders were hidden in the darkness all around me, making notes on my progress, deciding if I was worthy, deciding if I could be trusted. By late afternoon, I reached the confluence of the 3 creeks. The water was cold and clear. I could see salmon holding in the pools, their bodies like silver shadows beneath the surface, waiting for some signal only they could perceive, to begin their final journey upstream. I sat on a flat stone beside the water and waited, just as my grandfather instructed. I ate some dried salmon from the pouch he gave me. I drank from the creek. I listened to the forest settle into evening. I waited through the golden hour before sunset, when the light turned the forest to amber, when every spiderweb became a thread of fire. I waited through the blue twilight, when the first stars appeared above the canopy, when the owls began their calls. I waited through the darkness, when the only sounds were the water and the wind and my own breathing, when the moon rose and painted the forest in silver and shadow. I was tired. I was 14 years old. I had walked 15 miles through rough terrain. I had not slept in nearly 20 hours. Part of me wanted to lie down on the soft moss beside the creek, close my eyes, just for a moment. Part of me wondered if my grandfather had played a joke on me, sending me into the woods on a fool's errand, to teach me some lesson about patience or humility. But something told me to stay awake. Something told me the test was not over. Something ancient in my blood. Something that remembered a promise made before I was born, before my father was born, before his father was born. Then, sometime after midnight, when the moon had moved past the zenith, something changed. The forest went completely silent. No owls, no water sounds, no wind, nothing. Just silence so complete it pressed against my ears. And then something moved in the shadows between the cedars. What I saw next would haunt me for the rest of my life, not with fear, with wonder, and with a weight of responsibility I was far too young to understand. He came from the darkness like he was part of it, like the shadows themselves had taken solid form, like the night had decided to stand up and walk. He was over 8 feet tall, covered in hair the color of wet bark. His shoulders were so broad he seemed to fill the space between the tree trunks. His arms hung past his knees, thick and corded with muscle I could see rippling beneath the hair. His hands were enormous, each finger as long as my forearm. His face was broad and flat. A heavy brow ridge shadowed eyes that glinted in the moonlight like polished obsidian. But they were not animal eyes. They were intelligent, aware, more human than I expected, and more ancient than I could comprehend. I could see thousands of years of knowledge in those eyes, thousands of years of watching, waiting, surviving. He did not move like an animal. He moved like a man being very careful, like someone approaching a nervous horse, like someone approaching a crying child, like someone who did not want to frighten me, which was thoughtful of him, because I was absolutely terrified. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. My hands shook. My breath came in short gasps I could not control. Every instinct told me to run, to scream, to flee from this impossible creature that stood before me in the darkness. But something else held me in place, something deeper, something older than any lesson from any school, something that whispered in a voice I did not recognize. Stay still, breathe slowly, wait, trust what is about to happen. The old one stopped about 15 feet away. He tilted his head to one side, studying me. I realized I was being measured again. He was deciding something. Whether I was worthy of the same trust extended to my ancestors. 200 years before, for a long moment, neither of us moved. The water rushed past. The stars wheeled overhead. The entire weight of history pressed down on that clearing. I could feel it. The weight of every generation that had come before me. Every keeper who had stood in this exact spot, every promise that had been made and kept. And then the old one did something I have never forgotten, something I have never fully understood. He placed his right hand over his heart, and he bowed his head. It was a gesture of respect, a greeting, an acknowledgement of something that bound our peoples together, across generations, across centuries, across the vast gulf that separated his kind from mine. My grandfather had made me practice this response 100 times, standing in his cabin with my hand pressed to my chest, bowing my head at exactly the right angle, holding the position for exactly the right length of time. I had thought it was silly then, another of the old man's strange rituals. Now I understood. He had been preparing me for this moment my entire life. I stood slowly. My legs trembled beneath me. I placed my hand over my heart. I bowed my head. I held the position for 3 heartbeats, counting them out in my mind, just as my grandfather taught me. When I raised my head, the old one was smiling. At least, I think it was a smile. His face was so different from a human face. The features so much broader and more pronounced. Expressions were difficult to read, but there was warmth in his eyes. There was welcome. There was something I could only describe as recognition, as if he had been waiting for me, as if he had known I would come, as if he had been counting the years until I was old enough to receive what my family had been entrusted with. In that moment, everything I had been taught about the world fell away. Every lesson from the white man's school, every fact from my textbooks, every certainty I had built my young life upon, it all crumbled into dust and blew away on the night wind. My grandfather had been telling the truth all along. The old ones were real, and I was part of something far larger than I had ever imagined. But this was only the beginning, because I still did not understand why my family had been chosen. I did not understand what my ancestor had promised, and I did not understand the terrible price that promise might one day demand. Those answers would come, but they would take decades to fully reveal themselves. My grandfather's name was Thomas Standing Bear. He had been keeper of the pact since 1908. When his own father passed it to him at age 16, he kept it through 2 world wars and a depression, through the influenza epidemic that killed half the reservation, through the boarding school era that tried to kill everything else. He kept it when loggers came in the 20s, and again in the 40s, finding ways to redirect them, to protect the sacred places, to maintain the barrier between the human world and the world of the old ones. He told me the full history over the following weeks, in the hours between dusk and dawn, when the rest of the reservation slept. We sat together by the fire in his cabin, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls, his voice low and steady, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that told me every word was sacred. He made me swear on the bones of our ancestors, never repeat what I was about to hear, to anyone who was not prepared to receive it. This knowledge was not just information, it was responsibility, not just history, it was obligation. And once I accepted it, there would be no going back. The pact had been made by his grandfather's grandfather, a man named Walking Cloud, in the terrible winter of 1826. That year, the snow began falling in October. It did not stop until March. The passes were blocked before the elk could move to their winter grounds. The herds were trapped in the high meadows, where they starved, or were taken by wolves made desperate by their own hunger. The salmon runs had failed the previous fall. The fish turned back at the river mouths for reasons no one understood. By January, the people were dying. Walking Cloud was 23 years old. He watched his mother die of hunger. He watched his youngest sister die in the same week. He watched them grow thin and quiet and still. He watched his father bury them in ground so frozen it took 3 days to dig the graves. He watched the elders give their portions to the children, knowing it would not be enough, knowing they were all going to perish before spring. The tribe had lost half its members by February. Children wept until they had no energy left to weep. Then they went silent. That silence was the worst sound Walking Cloud had ever heard. In his desperation, he did something forbidden, something no one had done in living memory. He went into the high places where the old ones lived, the peaks and ridges and hidden valleys, places that had been declared sacred since before memory, places where no human was supposed to tread. His grandmother had told him stories of the old ones when he was a child, giant men who walked through snow without leaving tracks, who could disappear into shadows no deeper than a handspan. who had knowledge of the forest that made human wisdom seem like the prattling of infants. Most people believed these were just legends, stories to frighten children into staying close to the village. Walking Cloud believed them, or perhaps he was simply so desperate he was willing to try anything, even approaching creatures his people had avoided for generations. What happened in those mountains was never fully recorded. Walking Cloud never spoke the details aloud, not even to his own children. My grandfather said his father told him it was too sacred to be reduced to words. Some experiences could only be carried in the heart, never the mouth. But the outcome was clear. Walking Cloud came down from the peaks 3 days later. He was not alone. Walking beside him was one of the old ones. Behind them came 3 more of the great creatures, each carrying a deer across their shoulders. Like a man might carry a small child, they brought meat, enough to feed the surviving members of the tribe for weeks. They brought dried roots and berries from their own stores, food they had gathered in the warm months, preserved against the winter. They brought survival when there should have been only death, and they asked for only one thing in return: silence. The white men were coming. The old one communicated this through gestures and sounds, not quite words, but carrying meaning nonetheless, meaning that went beyond language, that spoke directly to something ancient in Walking Cloud's mind. The old ones had seen the white men arriving on the eastern coast generations before. They had watched them spread across the land like a flood, cutting the forests, plowing the prairies, killing everything in their way. They had seen what happened to those who could not hide, the great herds of buffalo reduced to bones bleaching in the sun. The wolves hunted until none remained. The bears pushed into smaller and smaller territories. The white men feared what they did not understand. They killed what they feared. If the people of the forest told the white men about the old ones, they would hunt them, as they hunted everything else. They would not stop until every old one was dead, until every trace of their existence had been erased from the face of the earth. So Walking Cloud made a promise. His people would never reveal the existence of the old ones to the white men. They would protect the high places where the old ones lived, discourage anyone from venturing into those sacred territories. In exchange for the help that saved his people from starvation, his descendants would keep this secret for as long as the mountains stood, for as long as the rivers ran, for as long as the salmon returned each fall. That was 207 years ago. That promise has been passed down through 7 generations of my family, each keeper teaching the next, each father whispering the truth to his son in the darkness before dawn. Until this moment, that promise has never been broken. But keeping it was about to become harder than my ancestors could have ever imagined. My grandfather taught me the ways of the pact over the following years. Every summer when school let out, he would take me deeper into the forest than I had ever been. He showed me the hidden paths, the secret places that only the keepers knew. He taught me which trails led to the high places, which ones to avoid, which valleys were safe for hunting, which were sacred ground where humans should not tread. He taught me the signals the old ones used to communicate across vast distances, calls that sounded like bird songs, but carried meaning across miles of wilderness, patterns of broken branches and arranged stones, messages for those who knew how to read them. He taught me how to leave offerings at the 3 creeks, small gifts of salmon and berries and tobacco, acknowledgments of the bond between our peoples, renewals of the ancient friendship with each passing season. The old ones were not creatures to be studied or captured or displayed. They were neighbors, They were friends. They were family. In a way that transcended species and appearance. In a way that most humans would never understand. And the pact was sacred. More sacred than any law written by men. More binding than any contract signed in ink. The pact had saved our people when nothing else could. It had created a bond that lasted through 2 centuries of change and destruction, through wars and epidemics, through the systematic dismantling of everything our ancestors built. Breaking it would be the greatest betrayal imaginable, a sin that would echo through generations yet unborn, a stain that could never be washed clean. I believed him. I kept the faith. For the next 30 years, I lived according to the old ways. I visited the high places when the seasons turned. I left my offerings by the 3 creeks. I occasionally glimpsed the old ones as they moved through the forest, like shadows made solid. I saw them grieve when one of their own died. A ceremony that lasted 3 days. Sounds so deep I felt them more than heard them. Vibrations that seemed to come from the earth itself, that resonated in my chest like a second heartbeat. I saw them celebrate when a new young one was born, a gathering of the entire family that filled the hidden valley with what could only be called joy, with sounds and movements that conveyed happiness as clearly as any human smile or laugh. I saw them age and weaken. I saw them pass from this world, just as we do. I saw younger ones take their places, learning the old knowledge, continuing the ancient ways. They were people different from us, but people nonetheless, with loves and losses, with hopes and fears, with histories stretching back further than human memory could comprehend. But I was about to learn that even the strongest bonds can be tested, and even the most sacred promises can become impossible to keep, because forces were gathering that would threaten everything the pact had protected. The old one I met that first night in 1951 was still alive when I became keeper of the pact in 1978. I had seen him many times over the intervening years, always at the 3 creeks, always in the hours around midnight, when the rest of the world slept. I watched him age. The black hair around his muzzle turned gray, then silver. His movements grew slower, more deliberate. The weight of years settled onto his massive shoulders. I called him Gray Face in my mind, a description that became more accurate with each passing decade. He knew me. He remembered me. Our bond had grown over 27 years of meetings, of silent understanding, of shared guardianship. When I came to the 3 creeks after my grandfather died, he was there. I was raw with grief, uncertain of my ability to carry the burden placed on me, wondering if I was strong enough, if I was wise enough, if I could ever be the keeper my grandfather had been. Grayface placed his hand over his heart and bowed his head, the same gesture he made when we first met. Then he did something he had never done before. He reached out and placed his enormous palm on my shoulder. It was the first time he had ever touched me. The weight of his hand was immense, warm and heavy and somehow comforting. He held it there for a long moment. His eyes met mine. I understood he was offering condolences, acknowledging the passing of one keeper, the rise of another, telling me, in the only way he could, that I was not alone. My grandfather passed the responsibility to me on his deathbed. He gripped my hand with surprising strength for a man of 92 years, his fingers like iron bands around mine. He made me swear on the bones of our ancestors, protect the secret as he had protected it, as his father and grandfather had protected it before him. He died on December 17th, 1978. Snow falling outside his window, the sound of wind in the cedars, my hand clasped in his. I felt the exact moment his spirit left. a lightening of his grip, a softening of his features. And then he was gone. The funeral was held 3 days later. Most of the reservation attended. My grandfather had been well loved, a man who gave more than he took, who helped his neighbors without asking anything in return, who carried himself with a dignity that seemed to come from another age. What they did not know was that he had also been keeper of secrets, a guardian of a trust that stretched back 2 centuries, a bridge between the human world and another world that existed parallel to ours, hidden in plain sight. Gray Face came to my grandfather's funeral. He stood at the edge of the clearing, invisible to most mourners, but visible to me, 50 yards away, partially concealed by an ancient cedar. I could see grief in his posture, the weight of loss that bent his massive shoulders. When I looked at him, he placed his hand over his heart and bowed. I raised my hand to my heart and bowed in return. The tears on my face were not only for my grandfather. They were for the weight of history that had just settled onto my shoulders. I did not see Gray Face again for almost a year. When I did, everything had changed, and the pact that had protected the old ones for 2 centuries was about to face its greatest threat. In the summer of 1979, the logging companies came. They had been eyeing the old growth forests of the Olympic Peninsula for decades. Various protections had kept them at bay: national parks, wilderness areas, tribal lands, conservation easements, a patchwork of designations that preserved these ancient forests, while the rest of the Pacific Northwest was being clear-cut. Now those protections were weakening. The economy was struggling. Inflation was soaring. Unemployment in timber communities had reached levels not seen since the Great Depression. The industry was pushing harder than ever to open the remaining wilderness for harvest. And the politicians were listening. The first survey teams appeared in May. Young men with orange vests and clipboards, marking trees with spray paint, measuring distances between ancient cedars. They drove trucks with company logos on the doors. They carried rifles in case of bears. They spoke loudly about board feet and stumpage prices, the fortune waiting to be extracted from these woods. I watched them from the edges of the forest, my heart growing heavier with each passing day. They did not know what they were doing. They did not know that the trees they marked for death were part of a world older than their civilization, a world that had survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, 10,000 years of human habitation. They saw only board feet. They saw only profit. They saw nothing of the sacred. Gray Face found me at the 3 Creeks in early June. The first time, he had sought me out rather than waiting for me to come to him. He was agitated in a way I had never seen, pacing along the water's edge, his massive hands clenching and unclenching, his breath coming in short huffs that fogged in the cool morning air. When he saw me, he stopped. He made a series of gestures I had learned to interpret over the years. The sounds came too, deep vocalizations that carried meaning beyond words, that spoke directly to something ancient in my brain. Danger. The high places were in danger. The old ones were afraid. I tried to explain what was happening. I drew pictures in the dirt with a stick, trees and machines, the devastation I had seen where loggers had already done their work, bare hillsides, eroded slopes, streams choked with silt. Gray Face listened, his amber eyes fixed on my face with intensity that was almost painful. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he made a sound I had never heard before. A low, mournful cry that seemed to contain all the grief of a people watching their world disappear. It was the saddest sound I have ever heard, before or since. The sound of ancient knowledge being erased, of history being forgotten, of a way of life that had endured for millions of years being swept away in a single human generation. The old ones knew exactly what was coming. They had seen it happen before, in other forests, in other mountains. They had been retreating for generations, pushed further and further into the few wild places that remained, watching as the world they knew was replaced by a world they did not recognize. And now even those places were threatened. I spent the next several years fighting the logging companies through every legal means available. I attended meetings, wrote letters, testified at hearings, told anyone who would listen about the ecological importance of old-growth forests, the spotted owls, the marbled murrelets, the countless other species that depended on these ancient trees. I joined with environmental groups who knew nothing of the old ones, but who understood the importance of preserving what remained of the wilderness. I made enemies among my own people. Some saw the timber industry as a source of much-needed jobs and income. They called me a fool and a dreamer, said I was holding back progress, clinging to superstitions that had no place in the modern world. They did not know what I was really protecting. They did not know that the forests were home to people who had been there before humans walked the earth. Through all of this, Greyface and his family watched from the shadows. I met with him every few months, reporting on my efforts, trying to explain the incomprehensible complexity of human bureaucracy, environmental impact statements, public comment periods, court injunctions, regulatory agencies, the whole Byzantine apparatus of modern governance, where decisions affecting the fate of ancient forests were made by people who had never set foot among the trees they were condemning. Greyface listened patiently, his ancient eyes reflecting wisdom that made my explanations seem foolish and inadequate. I do not think he fully understood. How could he? His people had lived outside human society for millions of years. They had no concept of laws or courts or government agencies, but he understood I was trying to help. He understood I was fighting for his family's survival. Sometimes he brought gifts, small offerings that showed he understood and appreciated what I was trying to do. A perfect arrowhead, clearly made by old one hands, worked with skill no human flint knapper could match. A bundle of medicinal plants my grandfather had mentioned, but I had never been able to find. Roots and leaves and dried berries with healing properties modern medicine had not discovered. Once, heartbreakingly, a fragment of bone. He laid it at my feet with a gesture that conveyed both sorrow and trust. It was from one of his family, a young female killed by a falling tree during a storm the previous winter. He was sharing his grief with me, trusting me with the remains of his loved one, offering her bones into my keeping as a sign of the bond between us. I buried that bone in a secret place, beneath a cedar my grandfather had shown me when I was a boy. A tree so old its trunk had split into 3 separate stems, each one larger than any single tree in the logged-over forests to the south. I have never told anyone where it lies, and I never will. The logging companies won some battles and lost others. In 1988, the spotted owl was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. Suddenly, the old-growth forests had a protector even the timber industry could not easily overcome. The surveys stopped. The orange paint faded from the trees. The roads that had been pushed into the edges of the wilderness were allowed to grow over. Alder and blackberry reclaiming what had been taken, returning slowly to the forest from which they had been carved. For a few years, it seemed like the danger had passed. I allowed myself to hope the pact would survive another generation, that my sons would eventually take up the responsibility, continue the ancient bond. But I was wrong, because a new threat was coming, one that no legal battle could stop. one that would prove far more devastating than chainsaws and logging roads, and it was already underway, already changing everything, already sealing the fate of those I had sworn to protect. The climate was warming. The snow that once blanketed these mountains from November to April was coming later, melting earlier, each passing year worse than the last. The salmon runs that had sustained both our peoples for millennia were declining. The fish returned in smaller numbers each fall, their bodies weakened by warming waters and changing ocean conditions. New diseases appeared in the trees, carried by insects that had once been kept in check by cold winters, but now survived year-round, eating through the bark of cedars and hemlocks that had stood for 1,000 years. Greyface showed me these changes during our meetings by the 3 creeks. He would gesture toward a stand of dead or dying cedars, his expression conveying sadness that transcended language. He would lead me to streams where the salmon no longer ran, empty waters that had once teemed with life, the gravel beds where generations of fish had spawned, now bare and silent. He was teaching me to see what was happening, to understand that the threat had not ended, it had merely changed form. The logging companies had been loud and obvious, easy to identify as enemies. The warming atmosphere was invisible, its effects gradual and diffuse, impossible to fight with letters and hearings and legal protections. How do you protest against a changing climate? How do you file a lawsuit against disappearing snow? How do you negotiate with an enemy that has no face, no office, no address, no representatives to meet with and argue before? There were no answers, only the slow accumulation of loss. Year after year, season after season, until the world I had known began to disappear. Then came the worst day of my life, the day I lost not just a friend, but a connection to something ancient and irreplaceable. Greyface died in the autumn of 2003. I found him in the hidden valley where his family had lived for as long as anyone could remember. He lay peacefully beneath a canopy of golden maple leaves. Very old, older than any human could be, his silver fur gone white, his massive frame diminished by the years, but his eyes, when they met mine for the last time, still held that same intelligence, that same warmth, that same ancient knowing that had welcomed me into the pact more than 50 years before. I sat with him through the day and into the night. I held his hand, enormous in mine, the fingers rough and calloused from a lifetime of moving through the forest. I talked to him, told him stories about my grandfather and my father, about the changes I had seen in the world, about my hopes and fears for the future. I do not know how much he understood, but I know he understood he was not alone. I know he understood that someone who loved him was there to witness his passing, that the bond between our peoples would not end with his final breath. Near the end, he made the gesture one final time. Hand over heart, bow of the head, I made it back, tears streaming down my face. My hand pressed against my chest so hard, I could feel my heart beating beneath my palm. Then he was gone. His family emerged from the shadows to mourn him. There were fewer of them than when I first met Greyface, fewer by half at least. The young ones looked thin and weary, their eyes dull with the cumulative weight of loss and fear. That was when I understood the terrible truth. The old ones were dying out, not from violence, not from disease, but from the slow erosion of everything that had sustained them. Their territory was shrinking, their food sources disappearing, their ability to hide from an increasingly intrusive human world becoming more difficult every year. Drones and satellites and trail cameras, hikers with smartphones, every square mile of wilderness now under surveillance by someone somewhere. The pact that protected them for 2 centuries was no longer enough, and I did not know what more I could do. My sons died young. One in Vietnam in 1968 when his helicopter went down outside Pleiku. One on a logging road in 1983 when his truck went over the side of Hurricane Ridge. The brakes failed on a curve he had driven 1,000 times. My grandsons do not believe in the old ways. They work in offices. They think their grandfather is a relic. They visit on Thanksgiving and Christmas, smile politely when I talk about the forest, count the hours until they can leave. I have thought about breaking my silence many times over the past 20 years. Each time I encountered evidence of the old one's decline. Each time I visited the high places and found them emptier than before. Each time I thought about my grandsons in their Seattle apartments, with no knowledge of the responsibility that should be theirs. Each time I pulled back, remembering the promise my ancestor made, remembering the weight of responsibility passed down through 7 generations. The white men still fear what they do not understand. They still kill what they fear. If I reveal the existence of the old ones, what will happen? Scientists will come with their instruments and questions, wanting to study and measure and quantify. Journalists will come with cameras and sensational stories, wanting to expose and publicize and monetize. Hunters will come, drawn by the prospect of the ultimate trophy, the kill that would make them famous. The government will come, wanting to classify and control and contain. The old ones have survived for millions of years by remaining hidden. They have watched civilizations rise and fall. They have endured because they understood the safest place was in the spaces between human knowledge, in the gaps of our understanding, in the shadows at the edge of perception. Revealing them now might be the thing that finally destroys them, but keeping silent is destroying them too. The warming climate does not care about promises made 2 centuries ago. The dying forests do not respect boundaries of ancient pacts. The shrinking territory does not wait for permission before squeezing the old ones into smaller and smaller spaces, until there is nowhere left for them to go. I am 89 years old. My health is failing. The cancer the doctors found in my lungs last spring has spread despite their treatments. I have perhaps months left, perhaps only weeks. When I die, the knowledge of the pact dies with me. My grandsons will never know what their ancestor promised on that winter night 2 centuries ago. They will never know that the creatures they have heard about in stories are real, that Bigfoot and Sasquatch are not campfire tales, but are neighbors and friends since before their nation existed. The secret will vanish into the past. The old ones will face whatever comes alone, without even the small protection my family's knowledge provided. That is why I am speaking now. That is why I am breaking the promise 7 generations of my family kept. Not to betray the old ones, but to try, in what little time I have left, to save them. I have seen what silence accomplished. I watched the forests shrink, the climate change, the salmon disappear. I watched the old ones decline from a thriving people to a handful of survivors, hiding in the last remnants of their ancient homeland. The pact was made to protect them from human violence, but human indifference is killing them just as surely. Perhaps if people know they exist, something will change. Perhaps if people understand we share this world with another intelligent species, with people who have their own language and culture and history stretching back further than our own. Perhaps that knowledge will finally wake us up to what we are destroying. Perhaps people will fight to preserve the forests, not just for spotted owls and salmon, but for the old ones who have called those forests home since before the ice sheets retreated. I know this is a gamble. There will be hunters who sharpen their knives at the thought of a trophy no one else has claimed. There will be researchers who dream of dissecting something unprecedented, publishing papers that will make their careers. There will be developers who calculate the value of the land, once its mythical inhabitants have been removed or destroyed. But I also know there are others, many others, who are hungry for a world that still contains wonder and mystery. People tired of a civilization that has measured and categorized and paved over everything that was once wild and sacred. People who want to believe the earth still holds secrets worth protecting, that not every corner of the map has been filled in, that there are still things beyond our understanding. I am speaking to those people now. I am asking them to honor the spirit of the pact, even if its letter must be broken. Protect the forests. Fight against the warming that is unmaking the world we knew. Leave wild places wild. And if you ever walk into ancient woods and feel that you are being watched, know that you are in the presence of people who have been here longer than memory. Treat them with the respect you would offer any neighbor. Treat them with the reverence you would offer any elder. Treat them as what they are. Family. There is one more thing I need to tell you before I am done. One more truth I have carried for almost 75 years. Since that first night by the 3 creeks when a 14-year-old boy met a creature from a world older than humanity. The old ones do not hate us. Greyface told me this in his way. Through gestures and sounds we developed over decades of friendship. He told me his people remember when humans first arrived, small bands of hunters following the ice, as hungry and desperate as any animal. He told me his people watched us grow and spread, watched us develop tools and language and art, watched us become the dominant force on the continent. He told me they watched us make terrible mistakes, destroying things that could never be replaced, killing each other over differences that seemed incomprehensible to creatures who had lived in peace for millions of years. They watched us cut forests, dam rivers, fill the air with smoke. They watched us grow so numerous our cities glowed at night like fallen stars. They watched everything they knew disappear beneath our spreading tide. But he also told me something that gives me hope. Even now, even at the end, his people still see something worth preserving in us. He said we are young, still learning, that we have the potential to become something better, if we can survive our own adolescence. He said the pact was made not just to protect the old ones from humans, but to maintain a connection that might someday grow into something greater. A true partnership between species. A shared stewardship of the world we both call home. That day has not come. Maybe it never will. But in the time I have left, I want to plant the seed of that possibility. I want people to know the choice is still ours to make. We can continue down the path we are on, destroying everything that stands between us and short-term profit, until there is nothing left but a ruined world, and the ghosts of all the wonders we squandered. Or we can change, we can learn, we can remember what our ancestors knew, what we have forgotten, that we are not the masters of this earth, only one part of a community far larger and far older than we can comprehend. My name is Joseph Silent River. I am 89 years old. For 75 years, I have known that Bigfoot is real, that they are intelligent, that they have been watching us since before our ancestors stood upright for the first time. For 207 years, my family kept a secret given in exchange for survival. A promise made in desperation, honored through war and peace, through prosperity and hardship, through all the changes that transformed this land beyond recognition. Today I have broken that secret for the first time. I broke it because the old ones are dying, because silence can no longer save them, because the world is changing faster than promises can adapt, because I am dying too, and I cannot bear to take this knowledge to my grave, without at least trying to make something good come from it. I do not know if anyone will believe me. I do not know if these words will reach the people who need to hear them. I do not know if the old ones will forgive me for breaking the promise my ancestor made on their behalf. But I know I have told the truth. I know that somewhere in the ancient forests of this continent, in the high places where cedars grow tall, where streams run cold and clear, a people older than humanity is watching and waiting, hoping we will finally become worthy of the trust they placed in us 2 centuries ago. That is my testimony. That is my confession. That is the secret I carried for 3/4 of a century. Now, finally, spoken aloud. To the old ones, if you are listening. I am sorry for breaking our promise. I did what I believed was right. I hope you can understand. To everyone else. The choice is yours now. The knowledge is in your hands. What you do with it will determine whether the pact survives, or whether the old ones disappear forever into the past, remembered only as legends and campfire stories. Honor them, protect them, give them a chance to survive the storm that is coming, because if they cannot survive it, I do not think we will either. We are all connected, whether we acknowledge it or not. The old ones have known this truth for millions of years. Maybe it is time for us to learn it too. Somewhere in the forests of the Olympic Peninsula, they are still there, watching, waiting, hoping. And now you know the truth that my family carried for 207 years. The question is not whether you believe me. The question is what you will do with what I have told you. The old ones are running out of time, and so are we.